Have you ever wondered what it means to be remembered, not for how you lived, but how you died? Some kings are remembered for their battles, some for their reforms. But Edward is remembered for his blood spilled on a quiet evening in Dorset. He was only a teenager when he was cut down, yet his death sent shockwaves through England. And for centuries after, people would honor him not as Edward the King, but as Edward the Martyr. Edward was born around 962, the eldest son of King Edgar the Peaceful. That should have made his claim to the throne straightforward. But his mother had died young, and Edgar remarried. His new queen, Ælfthryth, was ambitious, and she had a son of her own, Æthelred. Even while Edgar was alive, whispers at court suggested there might be a future struggle between Edward and Æthelred for the throne. When Edgar died suddenly in 975, those whispers exploded into open conflict. Edward was about 13. Æthelred was even younger, around 9 or 10. Both boys had their factions. On Edward's side were powerful churchmen like Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who saw in him the continuation of Edgar's support for monastic reform. On Æthelred's side was his mother, Queen Ælfthryth, and nobles who had lost lands or influence under Edgar's reforms and wanted a weaker boy king they could control. The kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war. Chroniclers describe bitter disputes, nobles refusing to recognize one king or the other. Some monasteries were attacked. Land was seized and redistributed. England's hard-won unity, built by Alfred, Athelstan, and Edgar, seemed about to fracture. But the church held firm. Dunstan backed Edward, and so did the bishops of Worcester and Winchester. In the end, Edward was crowned king, but his reign was uneasy from the start. He was a boy surrounded by enemies, with a stepmother who, according to later stories, never stopped plotting to replace him with her son. The chronicles paint Edward as a devout young king, pious and generous. But they also say he was fiery, quick-tempered, and not always able to restrain himself. Hardly surprising for a teenager thrust onto the throne of a fragile kingdom. He tried to uphold his father's support from monasteries and reformers, but that only widened the divide between church-backed reformers and powerful secular lords who wanted those lands for themselves. And then, in 978, came the moment that defined his life and his death. Edward was still only about 15 or 16 when he rode to visit his half-brother Æthelred at Corfe, in Dorset. It was the kind of visit meant to ease tensions, a gesture of goodwill, but it became the setting for betrayal. As Edward dismounted his horse, attendants rushed to greet him, but instead of honor, they gave him treachery. One stabbed him in the stomach, others pushed him back. Bleeding, shocked, the young king tried to cling to his saddle, but his horse bolted, dragging him along the ground until he collapsed, lifeless. That was the end of Edward's reign, barely 3 years, and finished in a ditch. Who was behind it? The sources are cautious, but the finger points clearly at Queen Ælfthryth, Æthelred's mother. She had the motive. Her son would now become king. She had the means. Attendants at Corfe were hers to command. And she had the ambition. No chronicler outright says she plunged the knife, but in the minds of many, she orchestrated the murder. The reaction was immediate and powerful. Edward's death was not seen as just another courtly assassination. It was seen as an outrage, a crime against the sacred order of kingship itself. His body was hurriedly buried at Wareham, but miracles were soon reported at his grave. A year later, he was reinterred with ceremony at Shaftesbury Abbey, where his tomb became a site of pilgrimage. For centuries, people flocked there to pray to him, and he was venerated as Saint Edward the Martyr. His cult grew so strong that, despite his short and troubled reign, he was remembered with reverence. Even in the 12th century, chroniclers still spoke of him as a holy king, cut down unjustly, whose blood cried out for vengeance. But Edward's murder had another consequence, one that would shape England's future. His younger half-brother, Æthelred, now became king. From the very start, Æthelred's rule was tainted by the suspicion that he owed his crown to blood. The kingdom was fractured, its nobles divided, its churchmen disillusioned. And into that weakness came the storm. The return of the Vikings. Edward the Martyr's reign was short, almost insignificant in deeds. But his death changed everything. It tainted Æthelred's legitimacy, destabilized the monarchy, and left England vulnerable at the worst possible moment. So when you think of Edward, don't think of him as a boy king who achieved little. Think of him as the spark that lit the tinderbox. His murder set the stage for one of the darkest reigns in English history. And perhaps that's why he was remembered not just as Edward the King, but Edward the Martyr. Because sometimes a violent death speaks louder than a peaceful life. Want to know what happened to the brother who inherited his crown? Stick around, because Æthelred the Unready story is one of disaster, invasion, and betrayal. A king remembered forever as England's great failure.